Thanks for the thumbs up. Very good evening to all our viewers. Welcome to another session on Master Speak. I hope everyone who's tuned in today is keeping themselves and their loved ones safe. Please do take abundant precautions as prescribed by the Ministry of Health and ensure that you don't let your guards down when you go about doing your daily routines. Now, let's give us a thumbs up by pressing the like button if all is well at your ends, which means that you and your near and dear ones are doing fine. Press the thumbs up button on your screen so that we know everything at your end is fine. Tell us which city or town you're logged in from. Don't forget to tag your colleagues, friends, and anyone who you want to join us for this session. And as always, don't forget to post your questions in the comments box. The two lucky questions will be rewarded with Amazon gift voucher. But for that, you have to stay till the end of the session. So make sure that you are with us till the end of the session, asking the questions. And the two lucky questions that I'm going to be posting to our speaker today will get Amazon gift vouchers. Lastly, you can find the recordings of all of our previous sessions on our website and social channels. Do find time to browse through those and go through the topics of your interest. There is enormous amount of wisdom and wealth of knowledge in those sessions from the previous session that we've had in the past few months. So please do make sure that you take time out and go through those. Now it's time for me to introduce our master speaker for today. It's also my absolute pleasure to introduce her. I'm happy to introduce Marianne Lewis, who is Dean and Professor of Management at the Carl H. Lindner College of Business, University of Cincinnati. A thought leader in organizational paradoxes, she is among the world's top 1% most cited researchers. Lewis studies tensions and competing demands surrounding leadership and innovation, and that's the topic for our discussion today. She applies her renowned paradox lens across diverse contexts, including strategy, product development, organizational change, and corporate governance. Her work appears in such journals as the Harvard Business Review, Academy of Management Journal, Organizational Science, Journal of Operations and Management, and Academy of Management Reviews. Thank you very much for joining us today, Marianne. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us on the show. And the topic that we have is extremely relevant in the times that we are going through, and I'm sure a lot of our audience are eagerly waiting to hear you out. So over to you, Marianne, and thank you very much once again for joining in.
Oh, Rakesh, it's such a pleasure to be here. I hope everyone can hear me, and thank you to Future Generali for these insightful and regular sessions for Master Speak. It really is an honor to join you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So that you can see my slides. Thank you. As Rakesh said, my focus for really the past 20 plus years has been on how to not only lead, but also thrive in a world of tensions. And when we think about tensions, I would encourage you to reflect on that experience you have when you're caught in that tug of war between competing demands. And the work that I've done really focuses on how these tensions surface, particularly in times of change, of scarcity and plurality. So what I mean by that is in periods of accelerating technological, social, political, right, all the realms of change. Scarcity when we feel like we have less than we need and we have some competition for those resources, but also plurality, demands coming up to us from all sorts of different directions. And as Rakesh said, we are living in the perfect storm right now in terms of tensions. They are all around us. When I think about tensions and their pervasiveness, I certainly think at the strategy level, how do we manage the short term and the long term, our financial as well as our social responsibilities, thriving in the global and the local, we could continue, but then they drive down into the organization. How do we set up our organizations to be centralized and decentralized, to encourage competition as well as cooperation and beyond? And then in our leadership style, how do we focus on the individual and build great teams? How do we provide the authority and clarity and foster democracy? And then down to the individual, from our day-to-day choices in how we spend our time, how we promote our energy, how we foster sustainability for our own learning, but also performance. So if we think about this web, we see tensions all around us. But what I would encourage us to think about today is a mantra that I use in my research and really came from Watzlawick and his colleagues at Stanford, that the problem isn't the problem. The problem is really the way we think about the problem. And in this case, the problem we're talking about is tensions. And I'd like us to push further and think about the way we typically think about tensions, because there's a very traditional approach, which is what I would call the dilemma or trade-off approach, right? We weigh the pros and cons of each side and we make a choice. It's a very either-or approach. In contrast, I would encourage us to think about tensions, and particularly those that are most wicked and challenging, as paradoxes. Paradoxes means thinking about opposing challenges as contradictions, but also as interwoven and persistent. So let me show you a particular example. Innovation. I've studied innovation in numerous fields. We live innovation in so many elements of our lives. Is it paradoxical? I would suggest that it is, because there are two sides of the coin to innovation. There is incremental innovation, which is how do we leverage our core? How do we build upon our traditions, continuously improve, and foster that sort of incremental change that enables progress really on a day-to-day basis? And likewise, how do we explore? This is the more radical innovation side. How do we think for tomorrow? Really think into the blue sky, invest in risk-taking big ideas that we create. Now, when we think about these, we can probably think pretty easily about how we need both sides. We need our core, our traditions, and we need the radical innovation for tomorrow. But they also pull us in contradictory ways. As Clayton Christensen would often remind us, we move into the innovator's dilemma. Actually, when we're talking about innovating in the core, we know who to talk to. We talk to our customers, we talk to our employees, we think about this ourselves. This is the world that we live in day to day. We know how to improve in this realm. But those same people are locked into a particular mindset that make it extremely hard and in fact build traps for us on the radical innovation side. These can be the people, ourselves included, that make it extremely difficult to plan for tomorrow radically. And both sides of this paradoxical tension persist. We can make decisions today about where do we invest from the radical innovation to the incremental, but we're going to need to make that decision on an ongoing basis because it continues. So why is it so difficult, though, to think about these tensions as paradoxical? I would suggest it's really for three reasons. One is we lean toward our preferred side. Some of us, take the example of innovation, are much more the bold, creative thinkers that are always looking to the future, and less focused on the details of today and the operational side. Others absolutely lean toward the other, right? Really good at that incremental problem solving. But we need both. And actually, as we start to feel the tensions, fueled by scarcity, change, and plurality, our anxiety in that tug of war can actually lead us to overemphasize our preferred side, creating these reinforcing cycles that actually grow the feeling of tension and can leave us sometimes paralyzed and stuck. So let me offer a case in point, an example that we can use today. This is one of my favorites, and that is the study of Lego. In the year 2000, Lego was recognized as the toy of the century by many sites. And not surprising, because for over 100 years, they had had year-on-year growth. I mean, a tremendous story of truly remarkable incremental innovation, starting with the brick, right? Starting with this beautiful toy and this strong focus on quality, disciplined values to fuel them. But shortly after the year 2000, they hit their first year of decline, and then a second. And they started really looking at themselves and their environment, and they realized so much had changed. The change in preferences of their customers, both children and adults, the changes in their competitors moving much more into digitalization and partnerships. And they asked themselves this very specific question. So what do we do here? We feel like we're at a crossroads. Do we focus on our traditions, what has taken us for the last 100 years upward? Or do we move into a period of radical change, radical innovation for the future? And they chose the latter. They chose to move towards an explorer emphasis and radical innovation. And in fact, they brought in some of the world's leaders to help guide them in radical innovation. And they were praised as textbook perfect in the work that they did. And within 5 years, they were on the brink of bankruptcy and takeover. To me, such a surprising, really opposite of intended consequences, results is exactly what sparked my interest in paradoxes at Lego, because they seemed to do everything right, but it led them almost to disaster. Thankfully, Lego's a great success story because they turned it around and really learned how to live, learn, lead, and thrive in tension. So I want to use this as an example. Now, I'm going to bring in my own research here quite a bit, but I want to offer a tool that I found very helpful, and I think it helps us dissect the case of Lego. This is from a colleague of mine, Barry Johnson. It's called a polarity map. The way to use a polarity map, you can use this yourself as an individual, in your teams, or even at a strategy level for the organization, is think about tensions, say as A and B, this core and explore as an example. You can map out at your very best with each side of the tension, what are the upsides? What are the possibilities, the positive possibilities? But the value of the polarity map is to think about, if you only focus on that one side to an extreme, there are downsides. And in fact, we can map this dynamics over time to actually see almost an infinity loop, because we can move so hard to our preferred side, say A, that we get to a point that it brings us into the downsides, at which point we have to throw all of our energies into the B, and sometimes can overemphasize, leading us into the same problem that we see in the future. So again, Lego. All right, so if we look at Lego in 2000 in particular, what we would see is a company with tremendously strong values. It is a family business, it is a private business. It's focused very much on quality, a disciplined approach, focused on their core of the brick. Headquartered in Billund, Denmark, very, very loyal fans, and this disciplined system of building blocks. But when we saw them start to decline at Lego, what we realized is that that strong core, because it was almost their entire emphasis, had led to some significant downsides. They were highly isolated, fostered by groupthink. They believed, understandably, after 100 years of success, that they absolutely knew best. They were very wary of partners. And in fact, stories, and I would encourage you to read some of the work, like The Story of the Brick, show that George Lucas of Star Wars fame was actually thrown out of Billund's headquarters 3 times as he was trying to pitch Star Wars Legos. And they said, we don't need partners. We know how to do this. Now, thankfully, the CEO at the time said to the board, I think this is a chance for us to take. So Star Wars became, and George Lucas became, their first partner. But they were also known for extremely rare product development. It took 3 people to say yes, 1 person to say no, to get anything through. It took a very long time. I'll give you the example. The color green in the 1970s was added. It was their 5th color at Lego. It took 7 years to agree. So think about the challenges. With an isolated group, arrogant, you see the complacency start to build in, which is why they were caught flat-footed when the market started to change and their competitors. So they swung the pendulum. We see this often in organizations. They went to the other extreme. And they said, well, if we can see the downsides of focusing on our core, we can actually go to the opposite side and really swing the pendulum. So instead of being isolated, let's build divergent insights, global design centers far outside of Billund. Beautiful design centers they built, particularly in Italy, as well as in Los Angeles, to really have places where the very best design experts from around the world could be freed from the traditions of Lego and Billund. They focused on radical innovation. The emphasis was on bold, creative ideas. Now Lego was more than a brick, it was brand. It was an experience. This is why they moved into everything from theme parks to retail, to movies, to digital, because there was so much you could do, and they expanded that concept dramatically. All sounds like very good news. As I said, it was considered textbook innovation, but they so overemphasized that side. You saw the down explore, right? They became incredibly inefficient. They lacked cost discipline. As the example, when they realized that they were losing money and actually had started on this decline, they brought in a tremendous expert who had been previously at McKinsey and who would become their next CEO. And he started examining how much money do we make on each box of bricks, for example. And the answer was, I don't know. He immediately said, how in such a smart, successful company have we lost that discipline? Well, they went on a new product development binge. Remember, it took 7 years to add the color green. In this period, they added over 120 colors. They were on a new product binge. They were flooding their retail partners with new products, which then had to be discounted. This is not a discount product if you know Lego. So they had confused their retailers, but even more importantly, they had confused their fans because it was no longer quite clear what Lego stood for and what they meant to do. So here they were, stuck. And knowing that they needed to figure out, again, do they swing the pendulum? How do they move to a capability that is both focused on the core and explore? In our work with organizations, big and small, and my primary co-author I would note here is Wendy Smith, what we have found is that the best paradoxical organizations and leaders really do a combination of things. They think differently and they act differently with tensions. I'm going to stress 3 steps. The first is you need to change the question. You need to move from the or to the and. Now that is not simply changing a word. That is changing our mindset. Now a traditional mindset really focuses on either or and trade-offs. And in particular, if we think about our understandings or assumptions that underlie those questions, I'd stress 3. First is our assumptions about understanding or knowledge. In an either-or mindset, we are seeking the truth. We are seeking one right answer. We need to discover it. This is why firms like Lego ask very specific either-or questions, like, what matters? Are traditions enabled brand or the possibility-driven future of innovation, right? The incremental or the innovate or the radical. The second set of assumptions is about resources. And in a traditional mindset, we have a scarcity mindset. We think of resources as a zero-sum game. It's how do we slice the pie? If one person wins or one team wins, another loses. It implies competition, internal competition, because you've got to fight for what you can get. At Lego, this pushed them in this either-or questionings to start thinking about, okay, how do we beat our rivals? Is it about the brick and our traditional toys versus digital? But also internally, is it about centralization versus decentralization? And you start to extreme internal competition for scarce resources at Lego. And lastly, our assumptions about leadership. Is the role of the leader to provide order and certainty, stability? In that case, as Lego was moving through this change to radical innovation, they tried to be really decentralized. They set up self-managed teams. This is when my co-author, Lotta Lucia, and I were studying Lego, and these managers were really confused. They said, I don't understand leadership in this realm. How do you manage a self-managed team? How do you be responsible and empower, provide stability, and encourage improvements? But these are the quandaries we get in an either-or mindset when the tensions are much more complicated than a dilemma, leading us to a potentially vicious cycle. So let's flip it. Let's look at a both-and mindset, or a paradox mindset. And my colleagues and I were just recognized in BBC. We can see some of that work here around our work in a paradox mindset, studied through 3 different continents so far and expanding rapidly. Here are the assumptions that start to change. Now we think about knowledge and understanding not as a search for the truth, but for multiple truths. We know that there are many ways to get to an intended goal, and we need to explore and invent. So in Lego, you start to see this change in mindset where they start asking questions like, how do we fuel innovation that reinforces our traditions and thrills our loyal fans? Still can be very radical, but within boundaries. Likewise, for resources, the next question really becomes, how do we foster leadership that is not about control and order, but is about learning, is about helping people cope, empowering them to learn and engage for the future. So for the abundance, we saw new questions about how do we create opportunities that raise all ships? How do we foster competition externally, but cooperation internally? And as leaders, how do we co-create energizing, innovative, high-performing teams for the future? The next piece is really, how do we act different? Once we start thinking paradoxically, how do we act and lead paradoxically? What we have found in our work is it's critical that we actually separate and connect. So when we think about the yin-yang and these contradictory but interwoven demands, how do we separate them and connect them? And here's what I mean. It's important that we actually separate the needs so that we can build distinct strengths. We can provide focus on each side and build value for each. This can be in a variety of ways, from separate structures, as in different teams focusing on different elements, roles like leaders who wake up every day and think about each side of the coin, metrics so that we're measuring and seeking specific targets on each side, different P&L centers, but also time. We might focus more on one today with reminder to everyone that the other still matters enormously, but we're just shifting focus to shift priorities. Likewise, we have to connect, right? We can build these separate entities, but they have to be linked at a higher level. We see that most valuably in how do we leverage vision as an overarching boundary that holds together the opposites, but also improvisation frameworks. You can see this in really wonderful examples like Unilever's emphasis on the sustainable living plan. Paul Pullman was just a role model in paradoxical thinking. And how do we build both the separate systems and an interwoven vision and frameworks so that we can double the profit of Unilever and half our environmental footprint? That was always the competing goals he held together. Netflix does something similar. Their vision to entertain the world, bold to say the least, and to do that by fostering top talent with the freedom and responsibility that they need. Now let's look at Lego, to how we bring together these elements. At Lego, first of all, they said, let's separate the core and the explorer. We need both sides. We know from the radical innovation that our global networks work, open innovation that fosters competitions with our loyal fans at a global level and fosters creativity. So they said, we're going to keep those elements. We're going to really make sure that we have targets, specific groups, including these design centers globally that continue to work. And we're going to go back to our core. We're going to make sure we have the discipline around our costs, around our quality and our supply chain, and our core values remain firm. So they separated both of these elements. In terms of the connections, they absolutely focused on vision and strengthened their higher purpose, which they defined as inspiring and developing the builders of tomorrow. Just think even about the words in that vision and its focus on the core, on the builders, and their deep desire to develop builders, not only through toys, but just learning more broadly. But that inspiration and focus on tomorrow really tapping into also their goals of exploration and radical innovation. But likewise, the notion of improvisation frameworks. So let me go into this a bit further. What I mean by that is if you think of improvisation in jazz or comedy, improvisation is about freedom within some simple rules, things that keep us focused. So in the case of Lego, let's think about their supply chain, for example, and their costs. When I talked about the brick, right? If we think about costs, when they only had 5 colors, right? And they were introducing one product every couple of years, managing a supply chain, even a global supply chain, was relatively clear. When they expanded to over 170 colors and a new product, sometimes 2 coming out every month, suddenly that supply chain is unwieldy, it's complicated, the costs were unclear. So they did some smart research. So I'm holding the brick for a specific reason. So this standard brick, we all know the standard brick, right? With the 8 dots on the top, right? This brick, the standard, the cost of this, hard to even identify because it is so small. Lego says that they make enough of the standard brick to circle the globe every year 3 times. It's constant production. But the specialty bricks, so think about a specialty brick that could be anything from some specialty Star Wars lightsaber or some high-tech tool. The cost of those bricks is typically about 100 times greater than this because it all depends on how many you make. And when radical new innovation was going crazy at Lego, the costs were skyrocketing and they weren't recognizing what was happening. So then they asked the question in their research, how many specialty bricks do you really need per box to get that wow effect? The thing that excites their loyal fans and says, I want to be able to use that, to play with it, to build with it. Well, not surprisingly, maybe with psychologists helping them, they found that number is very small. You only need less than 10% of specialty bricks in a box to get that excitement. And 10% specialty bricks ensures that every box of Legos has a very high margin. So you've got your controls under wraps, your costs. But the other thing you do, and we've learned this with improvisation in theater, as well as in other realms like music, is that those kind of rules are really empowering to creative thinkers. Because then you start thinking, say you're a designer at Lego, I can only have 10% of this box specialty bricks. They've got to be amazing. And maybe I need to talk to some other designers because maybe we share some of these specialty bricks and I get a few more in my box that I'm designing. And so you can see how this develops over time. Now we have empowered creative thinkers and a disciplined cost structure. That's what I mean by improvising frameworks. Very powerful, and we see them work on an ongoing basis. The final step to building a paradox approach to learn and thrive is to learn dynamic balancing. Here's what I mean by that. You've got to be consistently inconsistent as a leader. People need to know the big picture, how both sides fit together, how the assumptions are moving into a paradox approach, looking for multiple truths, seeking an abundance mindset when it comes to resources to grow the pie, and thinking about leaders that help you cope and learn and collaborate. But that consistency of the big picture is also matched by an ongoing inconsistency, because these tensions persist. Decisions you need to make today are going to change on an ongoing basis, and people are going to say, well, I thought we were focused on radical innovation, but now it looks like we're focused on efficiency and improving our core through incremental innovation. And you say, yes, both. Today, we're focused more in this topic, whatever we're discussing, on X. But remember, it's about X and Y. So this inconsistency. Another way to think about it is about this dynamic balancing. Einstein, who is an exceptional paradoxical thinker, talks about finding comfort in the discomfort. When it comes to learning how to ride a bike or walking a tightrope for that matter, you've got to keep moving forward and find comfort in the discomfort and learn how to see those creative tensions as opportunities. Paul Pullman often would tell his people when they were saying, how can we actually grow the profit and reduce our environmental footprint? Yes, you have to do both. We touch over 2 billion consumers a day at Unilever. We have no choice, and we can, by always thinking about both sides and continuing to experiment and push it further. So if we think about these 3 elements together, change the question, separate and connect, and learn dynamic balancing, we start to be able to harness the power of paradox, moving from this feeling of tensions like a tug of war that can lead us to paralysis. It's just, I don't know what to do. Either side has pros and cons, or to polarization where we lean too far to one side. And we see that vicious spiral we saw at Lego. If we think about the polarity map, we want to manage that infinity loop, but keep it in the positive side and avoid the negative. So I'd like to be able to answer some questions now and engage in more dialogue, but I hope that these 3 tools prove helpful to the future. Rakesh.
Thank you very much, Marianne. It was absolutely spellbinding listening to you.
Thank you.
You lived every bit to the reputation that you enjoy, Marianne, and I was totally engrossed in listening to you. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers today wanted you to continue this class. But hopefully for later. But you've given us a lot of food for thought, Marianne. The topic that you brought to table, I guess, is extremely relevant in all contexts, and more so in the current context that our world is currently existing in. To me, I mean, coming from a traditional mindset, it's always about this versus that. It's always versus something, right? But I think the point that you make is extremely relevant. Most of the time, it's about this and that. We end up doing that, but we never end up thinking like that. So absolutely fabulous, Marianne. Thank you very much for a very insightful session. Before I can open the questions to the audience, I'm very intrigued by the case study of Lego. You've given us a very good flavor. But I would be interested to just understand from you, Marianne, how did they go about changing their organization structure and design to sort of meet this new strategy and this new way of doing things? I'll be curious to just understand that.
Sure. So I think it's a couple pieces. It goes back to the idea, particularly of separating. So they started getting very serious about how do we look at both sides structurally. All right. So when it came to the core, they decided when it comes to managing their supply chains and particularly managing costs and quality, everything was going to be done in Billund at the headquarters. So they were really going to move back to this centralized approach for what they thought was out of control and was absolutely critical to, 1, maintaining their values, but 2, providing the cost discipline to be sure that they can be sustainable. So on the centralized side, it was really about managing control and quality and costs centrally. But the decentralization piece continued as well. And they said, okay, but let's be very purposeful about what is decentralized. And in particular, what remained decentralized was design and the more radical innovation. So they kept these design centers, particularly the strongest ones were in Italy and in California in the US, to say, let's make sure we have places that we can always kind of have this open funnel a bit away from the core, that we can have divergent thinkers who are really exploring radically and developing new and bold technologies. The digital was a big work that they were developing. But so I think on the design piece, it was thinking very purposefully about the centralization and decentralization, what goes into which bucket. I mean, I think the next piece you can imagine from that is then they had very specific leaders who controlled and woke up every morning thinking about each side, right? The core and the explore, but they were all on the leadership team. So you had an integrated leadership team led by the CEO, who was a very paradoxical thinker himself, to make sure that the pieces fit together and that that vision to inspire and develop the builders of tomorrow underlaid everything that they did, whether they were focused on costs and supply chain or they were focused on radical innovation. It had to be driven by both. So I hope that helps think a little bit about how.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Marianne. You spoke of leadership, and the example that you've narrated speaks of that. And the previous sessions I've asked these questions to our master speakers that everybody has a take on leadership, right? And in the context of the work that you do, you mentioned leaders are paradoxical thinkers. What are the other traits, according to you, a leader must possess to thrive in this world?
I mean, I do think the best leaders are paradoxical thinkers. And I mean, I've seen this in so many examples. I think these other features I would mention, I mean, the more we study paradox mindset and paradoxical leadership, the more we see them interwoven. So one is, I would stress, a growth mindset. Carol Dweck and the work on positive organizational psychology looks at this a great deal. A growth mindset is this focus on how do you grow the pie, right? And how are you continuously learning? So as a leader, I think Reed Hastings at Netflix is a really interesting example of a growth mindset, to be always thinking about how do we as leaders foster learning, performing, and engagement over kind of the controls and the more traditional ways that we might lead. So I also think about, Warren Bennis talks about the difference between a leader and a manager. And a manager is someone who does the right thing. A leader is someone who a manager, is someone who does things right. A leader is someone who does the right thing. And that growth mindset is really pushing on progress. So I would say add to a paradox mindset this growth mindset. I would also then add to that systems thinking is really critical. We see that with Donella Meadows and Peter Senge's work and so many others on leadership as systems thinkers, as people. I think this is part of the paradox mindset who don't just look at the symptoms of what might be the initial problem, but really try to get down to the root causes and seeing things as a much more complicated picture. I use the example of Paul Pullman and Reed Hastings in Netflix. I would add somebody like Muhtar Kent, who I had worked with previously, who was the former CEO of Coca-Cola. And at Coca-Cola, one of their kind of traditional tensions that they were always grappling with was the global and the local. Here you have Coca-Cola, one of the most prominent global brands. So scale is hugely important, being consistent around the world. And here you have a food product. Tastes, supply chains differ enormously at the local level. So you've got to be able to respect the local while building the global. And I think Muhtar always used a paradox mindset to how do you do both, thought about growth. How do we continuously learn and improve? So it's an ongoing experimentation. We will have failures and we must learn from them. And how do we think systemically? Think about systems, because if you are working, say, at Coca-Cola, but you could do this at a much smaller scale, right? You've got to be not only looking at your supply chain and your products, but how do global, geographic, demographic, right? Think about all the big changes that fit together. So I would add to paradox thinking those pieces, a growth mindset, systems thinking in particular.
Excellent, Marianne. Thank you. We've got questions now lined up from our audience. There are
Excellent.
two questions which are similar in nature, so I'm going to ask both of them together as one question. This is from Aman and Nidhi. The question is around when does tension become stress? And what is the relationship between tension and creativity? Can they both coexist?
Oh, such good questions. And they are very, very interwoven. So let's do the stress piece first. One of the reasons we see that people mismanage tensions is that they are so anxiety provoking, right? Particularly if we're not comfortable in tenuous situations, and few of us are. Even great paradoxical thinkers say, they feel their heart race, they can feel it in their stomach, their mind is, right, stressed in periods of tension. But studies of tension and stress show that, I don't think this will surprise you, that the curve is really shaped like an upside down U, right? Is that actually tensions and stress, right? The stress starts to go up to a point, but as we learn to get comfortable with tensions and we manage them as paradoxes, we find some opportunities there and we start to shift our framing. It doesn't mean that they're not uncomfortable, but we actually see opportunities there. And that changes the way we think and feel about the tension. So increasingly the work with myself and colleagues that really had been focused on organizational level has moved into psychology and focused on emotions, because stress absolutely is connected to tensions. And it's not always a bad thing, which leads to that second question about creativity. There have been some wonderful studies of creative tensions. And Paul Polman talks about this a lot. I mean, he says, if you don't have a tension and we're dealing with any sort of a problem with significance, go find it. Meaning go find me opposite, contradictory demands, contradictory views, and put them on the table so we spark the tension. Because tensions can really spur that creativity, especially if you've got someone who thinks about them as opportunities. So what we find in our studies of paradox mindset and creativity is that when tensions are present, those with a paradox mindset are significantly more creative. They're also higher performers and more satisfied than those who really think as an either or and get to those creative tensions and see anxiety and the negative side of stress, right? They see them as real challenges, problems to work through versus, oh, now we've got something to work with. I mentioned Einstein just as a comment. There was a beautiful study in the 1970s about creative genius, and it looked at Einstein, Mozart, Picasso, some of the world's great geniuses. And all of them, this was the pattern they found. They called it Janusian thinking. Janus is the god that can look both ways. It's very much about a paradox mindset, is that in their creative breakthroughs, they saw enormous opportunity in the tensions. From Einstein asking, how can molecules be in motion and at rest? How can they be particles and waves? To Mozart seeing the beauty and the power of harmony and discord simultaneously, to Picasso looking at light and dark, movement and stability in his paintings. So that the creative genius sees those tensions as fodder, right? Real opportunities for creativity is something, and it develops over time. It doesn't happen overnight. And so the other piece that we're working on in our work with a paradox mindset is more on how to develop those capabilities, because they absolutely can be learned. We learn the more we work through these challenges of tensions, that even when we fail, that we have learning opportunities from them, back to the growth mindset. And that helps us be more comfortable the next time it happens. The stress is lower, the creativity options greater. And we see that practice over time through experience.
Thank you, Marianne. I think that's so true. And what comes to my mind is there are so many organizations that you see, they're very large, very a good organization, healthy organization, but because they lack this positive tension within the organization, somewhere they're not realizing their full potential.
Yeah, that's so true.
And that's one of the questions from Raj, who's in our audience, is that how do you really, how do you prescribe that leaders should identify this organization needs to create a positive tension, and how do you then build that as a part of your culture, such that innovation and creativity thrives within the organization?
Okay, it's a great question. So the question is, how do you spark that tension so that you can use it positively? And so I guess I would say two things. There's one, how do you identify it? And the second is, how do you spark it? So the reason why I want to separate that a bit is that generally these tensions are all around us. We just may not be they may be latent, right? They may be under the surface because we're not really pointing them out. Typically what we find, as I said, is scarcity, change, and plurality surface them, so we start to see them, but you as a leader can surface them. Because you can think about, how are problems being framed in your organization? Are they too simplistic? Are they either or? And by simplistic, I really do mean, are they so narrowly focused that you're focused on really looking at the symptoms, which is going to lead you to a much smaller view of the problem, less complicated, less challenging, than saying, what's really the root cause? How do we bring more ideas onto the table? That was Pullman's point about bring me more ideas, make it more challenging. So you identify, they're there already. You're not sparking them. You are just seeing them with a sharper lens. Now let's flip to the how do you spark? Because one thing I find is really interesting in some organizations, I'll give you two examples, is that you can start the fire yourself, right? I'll give you the example. My co-author Kostas Andriopoulos and I studied product design firms in Silicon Valley in the US. These are leading product design firms. They build beautiful designs for all sorts of products, all right? But product design firms are interesting. You attract, retain the best talent in terms of designers and clients because you do something cool and radical and bold, right? But they don't pay the bills that way. Those product design firms pay the bills by doing, I'm looking for something, like version 2.0 of something. They pay the bills through incremental innovation, things that aren't bold at all, but that are better designs of something that already exists. So I'm showing you, a slide clicker as an example. That's how they pay the bills. So what we found in these design firms is they could lean way too far on the core, right? They had lots of projects from clients that were, 2.0 of a clicker or a mouse or a phone or, right, you name it. But if that was all they did, it would be catastrophic because their designers would say, this is not why I came to be a designer. This is boring. This is not what I want to do, right? And likewise for the clients, they'd be thrilled with what you did for them, but you wouldn't get new clients because they would want to know, what awards do you win? Show me something really impressive that you've done. So what these design firms would do is occasionally they would do their own. They would say, you know what, we don't have a client for something, but based on some of the work we've been doing, we're going to produce our own radical product. We may never even sell it, or if we think it's really good, we could actually spin it off to a venture capitalist and start a new company. But, we just design it and we hand it off. But they would actually start their own. And that was a way to spark it so that they would have both types of projects. Because the other piece I would say with those design firms is if all they did was those radical designs, one, super high risk, right? You will fail more than you succeed with a radical innovation, and you know that. So you're spending a lot of time, a lot of resource, a lot of energy on things that are high risk. So you have to have that balance. But the other thing, from the designer's point of view, if all a designer was working on were the radical innovations, it was actually exhausting because they would think about it 24/7 and they would burn out. So even the designers needed a blend. So they would build a portfolio of incremental projects and radical projects, and they would create their own radical projects when they needed it. Now, I want to give you one other example of that I just learned the other day in reading the No Rules Rules. It's a book by Hastings about Netflix. It's fascinating and really kind of digs into some of his paradoxical mindset. But Netflix went into their own film production or their own show production with Stranger Things. And if you haven't seen Stranger Things, I mean, it became an award-winning, and it was bold. And they decided, and this was a big decision for them because they'd never done their own productions, right? They were just a curator. And they decided, actually, we are learning so much about shows. Let's start it ourselves so that we also have another, like these product designers, we have a vehicle for the radical innovation and for really pushing the envelope and even helping other movie and TV show producers see what's possible. And it helped them be stronger and build so that they had both sides of the envelope. But it let them spark tensions in Netflix. So identify the tensions, but you could also spark them yourselves with some creativity.
Absolutely fabulous, Marianne. I want to give a shout out to our audience for asking these questions.
Yes.
We've got a few minutes into left, so please keep your questions coming in. Thank you very much for those who are posting their questions. Marianne, again, I've got two questions which are of similar nature by from Mithun and Madan. So I'm going to just put them together and ask you. And I think the context here I want to set for you is not an organization which has got lots of resources at their disposal or access to talent and so on and so forth, right? These are the names that we hear, but I'm talking about the ones that are relatively unknown, but they are businesses, right? So smaller businesses relatively. So in situations like these today, right, when so much has changed, most of the businesses or leaders are in a survival mode. So your prefrontal cortex is actually trying to fend off all the danger.
Right.
And here you're talking about paradoxes. Pretty much for them, it is always about surviving today to live tomorrow. How do you advise businesses who don't have access to kind of resources or capital or bigger markets? How can they use your framework and navigate this storm?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Rakesh, because you're right. I'm using kind of the big firms. These product design firms, by the way, were very small, but I work with family and private businesses all the time. And in fact, gave a talk, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, to a large family and private business group. In fact, I would just make a note for those of you in family and private businesses. Ward, W-A-R-D, wrote a wonderful book called Paradoxes of Family Business that is fascinating. Because even family and business is like, work and life kind of tensions and paradoxes that we feel, but it goes into much more. So let's think about kind of the tensions for today, in particular, for these private businesses or smaller businesses. Because you're right, you won't have as many resources. And in fact, this is one of the greatest challenges because you're going to have to be super lean, right? Incredibly efficient at what you do. But this world is changing very quickly. I mean, in higher education at the University of Cincinnati, we've always been focused on, experiential learning, for example, and digital. But the pandemic has completely changed what's possible on the digital. And that's in education. I'm talking with our employer partners. It's in Cincinnati. It's very clear. It's changing everybody's world on the digital side. It's changing the way we think about our supply chains, we think about our customers, our retail, our data. So I think that core and explore tension needs to be top of mind, even in the most challenging times, because if all you are doing is trying to tighten your belts and do better with less what you're doing today, you're not going to be set up for tomorrow. And we're seeing really rapid change all around us. So what I would say is, what I was talking about with Lego, I've seen that done at a team level, in a small firm, in a startup firm, saying, okay, are we going to have one group, even it could be one person, really looking boldly at tomorrow. What could the future bring? What could we shape for tomorrow in terms of our own markets, our own products, our own services, our own operations, but really having a future-oriented mindset. Well, you also have a group that's looking at, with incredible discipline, what's going on in our costs, our supply chain, our branding work, and how are we leveraging technology and data in particular. An interesting example I would share on this, without sharing the firm's name, because I don't think that would be appropriate, but is we have a firm here in Cincinnati who does data analysis for Kroger, right? Kroger is the second biggest retailer in the world to Walmart. And Kroger, now they have a lot of resources, right? So here they are focusing on providing grocery stores and pharmacy kind of work. Excellent. But this small firm that they do data analysis, right? They had always been doing data analysis for Kroger focused on retail, right? They were always saying, they were focused on how do they build customer insights from the data coming out of Kroger. But what they realized very quickly and smartly, because they were watching their primary client, in this case it was Kroger, right? They were watching them closely, seeing how they were responding to the pandemic. And within a month, and they moved quickly, they realized what Kroger was really going to need wasn't information on their customers. It was going to be information on their supply chain, so that they actually kept things on the shelf. And I watched this small and data supply company or data analytics company realize they could transfer what they were doing to consumer insights to look at supply chain. And they kept doing consumer insights, by the way, at the same time. They just literally split their small team to be looking at two different elements and start to innovate on supply chain while they continue to do their customer insights. They will have doubled in size by the time we come out of this pandemic. I think they've almost doubled now. And that's remarkable. But that was because they didn't panic. And I'm sure they did panic initially, back to the question of stress. I can only imagine the panic as they thought they don't need us anymore, right? Our main client. But that is a beautiful example to me of being agile and thinking about how to improvise so that they stayed focused on the core and built a small, focused, and impactful group for a new area. And the impact is going to be huge on this company moving forward. So I wish you all the best. I know it's incredibly challenging in these times of tensions, but I also believe that tensions provide great opportunities. And with the need to be lean, the need to use technology differently, and really the need to support our communities in new ways will help us think about, more paradoxically, about some of our core, our critical tensions, the core and explore, the profit and the social responsibility, the local and the global, right? I think that, back to the question of how do we actually surface and spark these tensions, those big ones are around us no matter what size firm or team you are on, and you can lead through them and you can thrive.
Thank you, Marianne. Next one, got time for a couple of questions. The next question reminds me of my conversation with Tom Peters on this show, Marianne.
I know Tom well. Yes.
So I made the mistake of talking to him about cost cutting and impact on people and all that, and I heard a earful. So this question, he's a big proponent of people. This question from Rajat is there about three P's: purpose, profit, and people.
Mm-hmm.
How would you order these three from standpoint of a business? Now, all three are important, but how would you go about,
Wait, give me the third one. Purpose, people, and what?
Purpose, profit, and people.
Oh, purpose, profit, and people. I would order them purpose, people, and profit. Because I'm a believer in Simon Sinek's work and the power of why. I think purpose is absolutely critical to knowing why we exist and empowering and motivating people to really get excited, which goes down to the people. You got to have that purpose clear. We've been working on this in my own organization in the business school here at Cincinnati, because purpose matters, right? Ours is to empower business problem solvers to tackle the world's problems. And once you know that, then you can focus on the people and say, okay, how do we make sure people are selected, retained, developed, and most importantly, empowered to achieve that purpose And now we're working on the third piece, which I'm following, great business leaders, which is the profit, is the business model aligned to support the people to achieve the purpose? So when I see the three Ps, I mean, you're absolutely right. They're critical, but I think that would be my argument for the order.
Yes, and rightly so. Okay, that brings me to the last question, Marianne, on this show. It's my producer is telling me it's time. Thanks for that, Ashish, for reminding us. So we've got a lot of students on this show as well, Marianne. About 15% of our audience is management student. And I'm sure a lot of them, I can see from the questions, are interested in knowing is the way the world is going, and from the work that you have done in past, what are the skills that are going to be the most relevant and most important for this generation, or for this current generation, or the generation after this, that they should be focusing on to succeed in future?
Yeah, absolutely, Rakesh. I mean, now you're talking about something I think about literally every day of my life as the dean of a business school, because higher ed is changing so rapidly, because business is changing so rapidly. I mean, I'm grateful because I'm at Cincinnati because this is exactly what we do, but I would stress you need to find opportunities to learn that really do things that build your problem-solving capabilities. So what I mean by that is, think about, one, the kind of problems you want to solve, really make a difference in the world, but also think about what kind of tools you could be really good at using. They could be financial, operational, people, right? Management, HR type of tools, and then practice. So in education, I think the best educational facilities, and I certainly put mine on there, they build experiential learning, because you need the classroom, you need that academic foundation to understand what those tools are, how you apply them, how you adjust them as needed, but you need the practice ongoing to make sure that you kind of go back and forth between theory and practice to build not only your skills and capabilities, but your confidence and your proven capabilities, so that when it comes to the job market, you can show what you can do. And being a doer, specifically a problem solver who is agile, innovative, and a paradoxical thinker is absolutely in demand these days. So I would encourage you to find ways to do that. And really also think about, as a problem solver, how do you leverage people, ideas, and creativity in that way. I think then you've got, and data. I mean, then you're really hitting on all cylinders, because to me, that's about leadership, entrepreneurship, and analytics. Absolutely critical in this day.
Fabulous, Marianne. That brings us to the end of the show. It was an absolute pleasure listening to you. And thank you for answering all the questions so candidly. Like I said, I totally love the interaction and all that you had to share with us. And I'm sure our audience listening to us today found it extremely useful. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much, Marianne, for taking out time and for being with us.
Oh, thank you, Rakesh. It's been such a pleasure. I appreciate all you do.
Thank you so much. And stay safe, Marianne. All the best.
All the best to everyone.
Okay, guys. So that brings us to the end of the show. Time for me to pick up the two lucky questions. And I've got them sorted here. The first question is from Aman, who asked the intention and stress and how to fuel creativity. Congratulations, Aman. Please send us your email ID so we can ship the watches to you. I hope you are still listening in. And the second question is from Mithun, who asked about businesses that are not as large, and how do they choose between survival and strategy on a long-term basis. So congratulations, Mithun. Thank you very much for asking the questions. Please post in your email ID to us and we can ship the watches to you. And thank you everyone for tuning in for today's session. The next session is on 2nd December, 6:30, and we have a special guest, the master speaker, Santosh Desai. Name needs no introduction. Anybody who's in the business of business or marketing would know Santosh Desai. He's a stalwart in branding. He's built brands and advises companies. He's going to talk about branding in digital world, 6:30, 2nd December. I would also like to thank our community support partners at Gully, Paul Reiter, Resultix, and Shulini for being with us and helping us spread the message. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'll see you on 2nd of December. All the best and stay safe.